this first bit isn't what I'm going to talk about, but a number of you know that I have this thing about American critics and Arthur Miller and the hostility of a number of them over many years, which reached the high point when the obituaries came out. Very ambiguous one in the New York Times, not by the principal drama reviewer, but by the second string one and a staff writer. New Criteria's, admittedly New Criterion is a fairly right-wing magazine. It was headed Arthur Miller, commie stooge. Wall Street Journal was Arthur Miller isn't well liked, and with good reason. And I thought I'd just bring to you today's The American Spectator, which marks the centenary with a piece headed Arthur Miller, Communist. And it says, Arthur Miller's been a communist. That's something that students in public schools and our woeful universities had not and still will not learn as they're spoon-fed Miller's left-wing morality plays. And so it goes on. Where are we? 2015? And they're talking about a period in his life which goes back 75, 80 years, whatever. Quite amazing. Anyhow, forget that. Imagine, if you will, a boy of 6 travelling alone across a continent and then an ocean. A boy from a small town in Europe who suddenly finds himself in a city of which he'd heard, but which had been spoken of in a language that would become alien. This is a boy whose parents thought him intellectually damaged and who only briefly sent him to school. As a result, he never learned to read, and late in life could still not understand that the world was round. Then imagine that he becomes enormously successful before losing almost everything in an economic cataclysm, while remaining a true believer in a dream of wealth, in a promise broken but ever renewed. This man, however, engendered a son who would challenge his beliefs in a country which lays claim to the future, brushing the past aside as Indians once trailed tree branches behind their ponies to conceal their tracks. He would insist on the moral logic of the past. He would create works in which fathers and sons were in contention. And this son of an illiterate father would write words which stirred the mind and pierced the heart. He would stage the drama of those who were the victims of their own misdirected passions, as they would be of a society too ready to betray its ideals. He would write of those concerned above all to invest their names with meaning, even as their actions would threaten to erode the integrity in which they needed to believe, even as they sensed that they'd failed in some way that they hesitated to confront. This man, Arthur Miller, would write of denial and betrayal, of the need to transmute guilt into responsibility. He would create characters who moved and occasionally stunned audiences, who recognized the private truths presented to them, as later they would acknowledge the public dimension of those truths, because, as you know, for him, private and public have a permeable membrane. The individual never abstracted from the world which shapes him or her, and which in turn they have the power to shape, if only they realized as much. An existential truth that would run through his work. And when he stepped outside his own fictions, he would demand responsibility of others, challenge those at home and abroad who thought to place limits on freedom, to constrain the imagination. And when he wasn't writing or defending those oppressed by ideologues, he was shaping wood from the trees he had himself planted, creating objects both functional and pleasing, signing them as he would the plays which shared precisely those characteristics. And when he died, he left behind a poem which invited others to look for him in what he had made. And so we do, which is why we're gathered here in a part of that city to which his father had once come in fear and hope, and where he himself began to write, believing that in doing so he would be entering into a dialogue with America. For what else is theatre but a conversation in which we, the audience, bring our own experiences, our own sense of what is true, to suffer a shock of recognition, but also a sense of transcendence, which comes from being led into a world in which the everyday shines with a new significance, as Gerard Manley Hopkins observed in another context, like shining from shook foil. In March of 2000, do you think you could close the door there for me, please? I'm here in the kitchen all the time. In March of 2001, Arthur Miller delivered the Jefferson Lecture for the National Endowment for the Humanities. It was held in the Kennedy Center before an audience of 2,500 people, which consisted in part of congressmen, senators, a chief justice, and the Washington elite. This, you will recall, was just after George W. Bush was elected, or if not exactly elected, then offered the presidency by the Supreme Court. That March, both the House of Representatives and the Senate were in the control of the Republican Party. Plus ça change. Before delivering his speech, he'd received a call asking him to tone it down. He refused. As he said to me, "I'm 85 and I don't care." The man who hired him was subsequently fired. Why? Because in his speech, Miller ridiculed politicians, more especially Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, and he did so by seeing them as actors, desperate to present themselves as other than they were. This was politics as performance, from a man who was not unknown for offering performance as politics. Of course, he accepted that, as he said, acting is inevitable as soon as we walk out of our front doors into society. Something his own plays had acknowledged from the very first. From All My Sons, in which a man recasts himself, playing the role of someone unjustly accused, and on to Willy Loman, whose profession as a salesman requires the invention of a persona. Willy Loman is a man with a script to deliver and a costume to wear, along with a smile and a shoe shine, which are part of the costume. He even performs for his wife, returning from his fruitless and debilitating dramas in New England, where he killed them dead, to stage himself to her as the success he wishes to see himself as being, even as that character begins to collapse. He has lost his audience as a salesman, as a husband, as a father, and who is he when he's lost that? An actor with no audience, not least because his identity has become synonymous with his performance. As a salesman, Willy Loman is an actor who settles for being well-liked rather than loved, which is the essence of his tragedy, as well as itself a part of the fiction he presents. Jonathan Franzen has remarked, "Liking, in general, is commercial culture's substitute for loving." If you imagine a person defined by desperation to be liked, you see a person without integrity, without a center. If you dedicate your existence to being likable, it suggests that you've despaired of being loved for who you really are. Willy is offered love by his family, but instead is wedded to the public view of himself, which is why he is astonished when for a second he realizes that the boy loves me. What does he sell? Something that unaccountably bothered a number of critics who thought Miller's failure to tell us a sign of the play's inconsequence. Apart from anything else, he sells a version of himself to his wife, to the woman in the Boston hotel room, to his son, to his clients, but most of all, to himself. He dies to sustain a fiction which is in some degree a national fiction, a dream of becoming through performance. He stages his death, a suicide, which is to seem an accident or the insurance company won't pay off. Willy Loman's problem was he thought performance and reality were the same thing, that he was his social role, which is why the play is called Death of a Salesman and not Death of Willy Loman. He dies as a salesman, still selling a bill of goods, the dream that has destroyed him and yet which he wants to sell on to his sons, one of whom, Happy, is already an actor, laying claim to a role that is in fact not his own, building a narrative that gives him a meaning his life apparently does not. The other, Biff, has travelled back because he has in part bought into his father's dream, feeling that he's not got anywhere, sharing the discontent that is his father's heritage and that of his society. Happiness in his culture is not a state. It is to be endlessly pursued, a green light across the bay. Failure to succeed in a private and public drama is in some ways not to have lived at all. For Miller, the salesman, as he said, is close to being the universal occupation of contemporary society. Everybody is selling and everything is for sale. In the Crucible, a young woman performs a drama for the benefit of members of the court who become an audience, invited to suspend their disbelief, except that they are already inclined to believe in a theological drama which pitches good against evil, a religious melodrama presented as social, political, and legal truth. This performance is stage managed, directed, and performed by Abigail in a society in which reality is defined by a belief in the existence of witches, and those who would deny it dismissed as subversives challenging the law. In Puritan New England, anyone who fails to follow the text is no longer performing the prescribed role, and there's a price to be paid for departing from that text. There's always a price to be paid for dissent, and Miller paid it, as did those he would one day seek to aid. In a view from the bridge, two illegal immigrants must masquerade, perform, as what they are not, even as Eddie Carbone has to deny the truth of his feelings, playing the role of a concerned surrogate father, even as something else drives his actions. Acting, in other words, is a part of who we are. But as Tennessee Williams' character remarks, there are no lies, but those thrust down the throat by the hard-knuckled hand of need, which accounts for the compassion with which, even in the midst of the personal and public betrayals of HUAC, Miller presents the informer as a tragic figure in a view from the bridge, which is a bit breathtaking, really. The offence, as far as the critics of the Jefferson Lecture was concerned, lay in his disrespect for authority, his partisanship. His was an act of lèse-majesté. While he accused Al Gore of going through several changes of costume before finding the right mix to express the personality he wished to project, Bush was simply a bad actor who had to learn, quote, to cease furtively glancing left and right when leading up to a punchline, followed by a sharp nod to flash that he successfully delivered. It's such a perfect description of exactly what he did, I have to say. Nixon, he said, was acting during all his waking hours, his entire working life a recorded performance. Johnny Carson once remarked of Nixon that, I hear that whenever someone in the White House tells a lie, Nixon gets a royalty. He wasn't alone in his hostility. President Harry Truman remarked that Nixon was a no-good lying bastard, adding that he can lie out of both sides of his mouth at the same time, and even if he caught himself telling the truth, he'd lie just to keep his hand in. I am not a crook, said the crook, Richard Nixon, staring into the television camera with all the conviction of a practiced actor, a role in which it is perhaps feasible he had taken for the truth. As he was later to say of his involvement in the Watergate scandal, I was not lying. I said things that later on seemed to be untrue. As Hamlet said, seems, I know not, seems. As to Reagan, he'd long since failed to distinguish reality from fantasy, confusing his actual life with roles he'd played in the movies, or as Miller observed, simply movies he'd seen. Meanwhile, he said, the closest thing to a deliberately rehearsed passion Miller had witnessed, he informed his startled audience at the Jefferson Lecture, which by now resembled the audience of the producers as the cast swing into Springtime for Hitler, was, as he said, the organized mob of Republicans banging threateningly on the door of a Florida vote counting office and howling for the officials inside to stop counting. Watching this outburst, he said, I could practically hear the rehearsal. Seems to me, he said, that one is surrounded by such a rolling mass of consciously contrived performances, it gets harder and harder for a lot of people to locate reality anymore. A statement which might, of course, be seen as bearing on theatre itself, and which was not only a concern of his late plays, though several of those did indeed focus on this question, but then I suspect most of us have experienced the anxiety that someone will one day tap us on the shoulder and suggest that we have only been playing the role of grown-ups, that the title professor suggests a significance to which in truth we hardly aspire, that we're all too conscious of the knowledge that we don't possess the books we haven't read, that we play a role. Or is it just me? Hilary Mantel, in contemplating her own characters in A Place of Greater Safety, her novel set at the time of the French Revolution, asked how far those in the spotlight of history are owned by themselves or the public, and what happens to people when they're manufacturing their own legend day by day, when they become self-conscious. For her, too, there was a parallel with the actor. How far, she wondered, does the persona extend? At what point does the mask grow onto the face? It's not hard to see why the lecture was denounced, though those who did so had their own political positions. It was attacked by the Jewish World Review, whose founder was on record as saying, "It's hard to understand a religious person who votes Democrat." And by William Buckley's less surprising Conservative National Review, which described his speech as appalling, a disgrace. Of course, Miller accepted that performance was the essence of theatre and indeed of social life. He was merely regretting the degree to which it had become central to the selling of politicians, a confusion of realms. The theatre, he accepted, fabricated everything, as he said, from the storm's roar to the fake lark's song, from the actor's calculated laughter to his nightly flood of tears. But though, as he said, the actor lies with all the spontaneity that careful calculation can lend him, he may nonetheless fabricate a vision of some important truth about the human condition that opens us to a new understanding of ourselves, what Edward Albee called lying in the direction of truth. I'm interested, though, in the degree to which he was throughout his career, and especially in his later plays, fascinated with the implications of the performing self. This man who once married Marilyn Monroe, an actress who performed the role of Marilyn Monroe on screen and sometimes off. But then, as I suggested, we do indeed all perform, switching effortlessly from accent to accent, depending on our social circumstances, from role to role, as we address different audiences. At one moment, a wife, at another, a lover, and woe betide any who confuse the two performances. Actors exist to perform, becoming through performance. Sometimes actors are extraordinarily shy off stage, but assured on stage. They literally embody the words written on a page, or improvise as a means of understanding who they are to become. It's interesting to watch sometimes at rehearsals as some actors perform at the read-through, committing themselves linguistically, if in no other way, while others simply read the text, sometimes uninflected and certainly without whatever it is that lifts word from the page, as yet the only audience being those involved in the production. There can be a curiously competitive element to the read-through and subsequent rehearsals. A performance, who has the greater power? The one who is first off book and therefore can shape the performance of those who are not, or the one who delays and necessitates changes by those who have exposed themselves before meanings are fully engaged. I watched exactly a competition like that, incidentally, in the American rehearsals of Broken Glass. The chief culprit was Ron Silver, head of Actors Equity, who would later withdraw from that production. What then is the American, this new man? Asked Creve Coeur, a question that has never been answered because it's a country where people go to reinvent themselves, restage themselves, as Gatsby did, as every immigrant hopes to do. They went to become something else, to take on a new role in a national drama of becoming. Sometimes, along with the new role, appropriately enough, went a new name. You can change your name, says Hester Prynne, to Dimsdale, urging her lover to draw a line across his past. How many Jewish actors masqueraded, performed as Goyim? That they should have felt constrained so to perform says something, of course, about a society that was presumed to prefer performance to reality. They don't mind if you're gay as long as you don't appear to be gay. They don't mind if you're Jewish as long as you don't appear to be Jewish. You have to perform the role that's required, not the role in the film or the stage play or whatever it is, the role in engaging with the society. But you didn't have to be Jewish to change your name. It was an American birthright. It's always morning in America, as a Reagan television advertisement declared. You can always start again, assume a role. In a supposedly secular country that is deeply Christian, you can be born again. America's belief in the self-made man is not merely an ideological commitment, it's an existential declaration. You can remake yourself in America. America's belief then, the actor becomes a national paradigm, and transformation through performance a bright possibility and a dark temptation. Jay Gatz emerges as Jay Gatsby, whose own past roles may simply have been just that, and who performs the role he believes Daisy Buchanan wishes him to play. Richard Whitman becomes Don Draper in Mad Men, though losing himself somewhere along the way, insofar as performance may threaten the authenticity for which there's a natural yearning. There's a sense in which all theatre is meta-theatre. We are inevitably reminded that it is a performance. How could it be otherwise when the whole apparatus of theatre is on show as we enter the auditorium with plush seats or hard benches, see a curtain behind which the Wizard of Oz in the form of a director, stage and costume designer is preparing his or her artifice. We clutch our programmes which tell us the real names of the actors who are about to insist that they're someone else. The curtain rises, the after eights are noisily passed, a cell phone bleat is silenced once the owner has sorted through a handbag seemingly containing half the contents of the known universe, and figures who an hour before painted their faces and rehearsed their lines in their heads step forward in the simulacrum of life. We know it for a performance, and yet we know it for a truth. An actor is Protean. One of the central characters in Two Gentlemen of Verona, a deceiver, is actually called Proteus. So adept are actors at dissembling that in Rome they were not allowed to run for the magistracy, but since they would put politicians, mere amateurs at lying, at a disadvantage. Need I say Richard Nixon was an enthusiastic actor at Whittier College, and thereafter for the rest of his life, though not lying in the direction of truth. In the 1960s there was a rebellion against this central truth of theatre. Actors stepped forward and gave their real names. At times they stripped themselves naked as if that could be a guarantee of truth, believing that the body speaks truth as language may not, a conviction that I suspect men and women through the ages have discovered to be erroneous. The reason for this was in part that there was enough deceit in the political and commercial world without the actor becoming complicit. But language was central to Miller, and performance theatre tended to evidence a suspicion of language, not least because of a consciousness of the uses to which it had been put. One group, you'll remember, chose to treat the Crucible as a found object, until Arthur Miller, through his lawyers, pointed out that he hadn't lost it. Later he regretted his actions. Miller wasn't a fan of performance theatre or the avant-garde in general. He met Dylan Thomas, a fellow inhabitant of the gloriously anarchic Chelsea Hotel. When my daughter stayed there, incidentally, when she opened the door of her room, she discovered a drama group rehearsing in her bedroom. Thomas described a visit that he and Miller made to a play performed, as Dylan Thomas recalled, in a cellar or a sewer, and in the middle, Miller said, "Good God, this is avant-garde. In a moment, the hero is going to take his clothes off." He did, says Dylan Thomas. Later, Miller wrote, but never published, a parody in which actors began naked and slowly dress, while the audience members make sexual advances to one another, which was a comment on the living theatre, some of whose actors did indeed seek to break down the barriers between audience and performer in a manner which today would probably have led to a court appearance. What was wrong with performance theatre to Miller was that it sidestepped rationality. It distrusted language and indeed distrusted the writer. He went to see the musical Hair, which opened off Broadway in 1967, then moved to Broadway in 1968. It appeared to him to celebrate liberation of the body and the mind, to pose a generalized sense of revolt without addressing the political realities of Vietnam. After all, this is 1968, and the pivotal moment in that war, the Tet Offensive, occurred in January of 1968. He also thought that performance theatre lacked an interest in the past, except as myth. For Miller, the past was, as he said, the seedbed of current reality and the way to possibly reaffirm cause and effect in an insane world. He was aware, though, that his own culture had, as he said, deemed amnesia as the ultimate mark of reality. Gore Vidal agreed, referring to the United States of amnesia. For Miller, to deny the link between past and present, between cause and effect, is not only to deny social responsibility, it's to deny the basis of morality. His own plays, he said, are refracting the past all the time, because I don't really know how to understand anybody only from his present actions. We need the past to comprehend anything. As he once told me, you can no more escape the past than you can the beating of your own heart. His interest in performance took a different form. In Playing for Time, Miller adapted Fania Fenelon's memoir of playing in the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra. Fenelon was a half-Jewish cabaret singer who ended up in Auschwitz-Birkenau. She, like her fellow musicians, was Scheherazade, performing to live rather than living to perform. The music was true, if simultaneously a mockery of those who were marched to work and ultimately to their deaths as they played that music. But they were obliged to please the killers who were their audience. The contract between performer and audience was thus compromised and tainted at source. They were playing their instruments, but equally playing the normality of an orchestra, appealing to those with the sophistication to judge the harmony they sounded in an environment in which the only harmony was that of a common suffering and potentially common death. They were performing in two ways. They performed their music, but they also performed the role of an orchestra. The prisoner musicians find some solace as they retreat into the music they play, but its discipline, their pride in professionalism, can be a means of denying the reality of their position. They are perforce collaborators, their music being enrolled in the cause of the annihilation of others. Indeed, the Nazis, of course, went out of their way in the camps to dress the set of their dark drama. From the sign over the entry gates promising that work will set those who pass through them free, to railroad terminals, terminal in every respect, sometimes complete with hanging baskets of flowers. Victims were directed, as you know, to showers. All this was performance. This was theatre, not as a pathway to truth, but annihilation. The stage was set, the performance rehearsed and practiced, performed ultimately for those in Berlin who had both written the script and were an appreciative audience. The Miller play in which performance becomes central to the plot as to the characters, however, is the Archbishop Sealing, set in an unnamed East European city, in fact, Prague. Indeed, Václav Havel claimed to be one of the characters. The context for the play is one with which we have recently become all too familiar, with revelations of the widespread surveillance of the NSA and GCHQ in Britain, but which had a particular edge at a time when Richard Nixon in the White House was recording himself and the CIA was bugging Washington hotels in the United States. At the same time, in Eastern and Central Europe, there was no guarantee that conversations could be private, as Miller had learned on his visits to Russia and Czechoslovakia. Some of the time, if you recall, Nixon obviously played a role for the invisible microphones. He remembered they were there, so he turned into an actor and performed for them. His was a performance, his lines carefully calculated. At other times he plainly forgot they were there, as he inadvertently built a case against himself, playing a leading role in his own demise, an exquisite irony which maintains its appeal, and which I suppose would qualify him as a tragic hero were it not for the fact that we're talking about Richard Nixon. Meanwhile, in Archbishop Sealing, there may or may not be microphones concealed in the ceiling. And as with Nixon, for some of the times, they all perform for what they assume to be a hidden audience, while for some of the time they forget. Václav Havel himself discovered a microphone in his chandelier and returned it to the police on the grounds that it was their property. No wonder he thought he was a character in Miller's play. And I should tell you, incidentally, I once did an interview with Arthur, and I think several people will know this, in Salzburg, in an old Archbishop's palace. You know, this was about Archbishop's palace, and we were in an Archbishop's palace, and we had radio mics on and retired into the library as the audience came in, and we were discussing how many ex-Nazis were coming into the audience. Afterwards, Austrian television sent me a recording, and our conversation was on the beginning. We had bugged ourselves in an archbishop's palace. Well, there is plenty of politics to this play, but Miller's interests go beyond this. As he asked, when are we talking to whoever we are talking to? And when are we talking to authority? Whether it is the authority of the university or the city administration or actual government. He added there were two listeners in every conversation. One was the person you're talking to, the other was some authority or another. So how do you wriggle through that maze, and what is left of you finally when you have wriggled through it? Can you identify yourself anymore? So the nature of human reality began to come into play, as he said. Could you even, he asked, speak of sincerity anymore, since everybody had to engineer his speech in one way or another, even with the best of motives? So this is not just a play about Central Europe. Beyond the question of surveillance, it's about the way the language we use shapes the people we are. What do we think when we defend theatre subsidies on the grounds of the money tourists bring into the country? What do we think when we stress the extent to which a university education is about career potential, adjusting not only our language but ultimately ourselves to what is perceived to be a reality? This is a world in which performance has replaced being, a world in which people lie, the state to maintain its power, the individual to protect him or herself against that power. What is real becomes ever more difficult to know. As Miller said, we're all impersonators in a way. We're all impersonating something, including ourselves. We have all become actors. Our country, a character remarks in the Archbishop Sealing, is now a theatre. Miller saw the same thing in America as privacy ceded territory to public performance. And ahead, of course, lay the misnamed reality TV, in which people offered themselves up for bugging, with concealed cameras staging their lives as soap operas. There is a CCTV camera for every 10 people in the United Kingdom, and we all apparently appear on them 300 times a day, and this is not counting the cameras in phones. Images from such cameras have become staples of television programs in which we watch mini-dramas played out for our entertainment as police pursue speeding drivers and a shoplifter secretes a frozen chicken. Life a spectacle. Even war has become a spectator sport as cameras in the nose cones of missiles dramatise the ending of enemy lives, often to a smatter of applause from the press conference convened to show the efficacy of so-called smart bombs, not always, however, quite smart enough to distinguish friend from foe, insurgents from Reuters journalists. If you watch the video released by WikiLeaks, which shows those in a helicopter gunship killing civilians, including Reuters journalists and children, it has an epigraph from George Orwell. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give the appearance of solidity to pure wind. Those paraded in orange jumpsuits in Guantanamo or against a desert backdrop by ISIS are part of a conscious ritual, scripted, staged, offered to a viewing public as secure in their anonymity as those who sit in bases in Texas and Nevada controlling drones which can kill a person at the press of a button thousands of miles from their victims. Miller's last play, Finishing the Picture, features a performance within a performance. It's set in the Mapes Hotel in Reno, where The Misfits was being filmed. At its heart is Marilyn Monroe, herself not only an actress, but a conscious construction, who had, like Gatsby, sprung from her platonic conception of herself. In Blonde, a fictionalized version of Monroe, Joyce Carol Oates quotes Jean-Paul Sartre's observation that genius is not a gift, but the way a person invents in desperate circumstances, which I think is actually quite accurate when it comes to Marilyn Monroe. Much the same could be said of the Misfits film itself, in which she was, in effect, asked to play herself, objecting when required to deliver lines that didn't reflect what she saw as the reality of her life. Film tends to see realism as a source of authenticity. The sheer size of its images, its denial of any possibility of interaction between performer and audience, structuring responses. Performances in film are frozen. No matter how many takes there may have been, and with Marilyn there were many, there is only one on the screen, one which will remain the same this year, next year, and as long as the film survives. In the theatre, performances, as we all know, are modified by audiences. Different productions with different actors and directors refract the text differently, underscore the status of theatre as a shifting conversation in which the text is in truth the whole production. I once saw Peter Brook's production of Midsummer Night's Dream. I can't begin to explain to you what was so remarkable about that. There is no repeating performance. You can describe it. It's like describing a party. You can't do it. You can't give the essence of what there. That's exactly what's gone missing. Performance is irrecoverable. Certainly a filmed or video recording misses its essence. The body is there, only the soul has fled. Now you can see productions on cinema screens hundreds of miles from the theatre in which they were recorded. Even if live, they're resistant to audiences. Actors hear and see no response. Audiences do not breathe the same air as the actors. At the end, audiences are unsure whether even to applaud, for there are no actors there for their response. From a purely theatrical point of view, a contract has been broken. In Middle English, the phrase "to perform much time" means to live long. To live and to perform can be seen as synonymous. And that's the sense in which Miller suggested that we are all performers, performing even to ourselves and to the very end. As the English novelist Sybil Bedford remarked, when one's young, one does things because they're not for good. Everything's a rehearsal, to be put right when the curtain goes up in earnest. One day, you know, the curtain was up all the time. That was the performance. It was Thomas Mann who remarked that a man lives not only his personal life as an individual, but also consciously or unconsciously the life of his epoch and his contemporaries. A few people did that prove more true than Arthur Miller. But it turned out that it wasn't only his own epoch and his own contemporaries that he addressed and reflected. The centenary of his birth has been marked by a cascade of productions around the world. I'm thinking of unsubscribing from my Miller Google alert. So my inbox overflows every day like the porridge in Fantasia. And those productions are not greeted as relics of another age. Audiences and critics alike comment on their contemporary significance. I give you All My Sons and Volkswagen. These are plays which live on the pulse. But that may be true of any production. There are always new audiences. There is always a new context. There are always new imaginations which come together to create that performance. Earlier this year, the London production of A View from the Bridge, quite remarkable, coming to. America, won the Olivier Award for Best Revival. It also won Oliviers for the actor who played Eddie Carbone and for the director. Arthur Miller's friend, the peace campaigner William Sloane Coffin, I love the name, supporter of the civil rights movement and fierce opponent of America's involvement in Vietnam, once said, "I feel strongly that Oliver Wendell Holmes was right. Not to share in the activity and passion of your time is to count as not having lived." But he added, St. Augustine said, "Never fight evil as if it were something that arose totally outside yourself." Miller often stood beside him in his battles for justice during the Vietnam War, and also rejected the notion that evil is wholly external to the self, as he has a character remark in After the Fall, "To maintain our innocence, we kill most easily." America, perhaps more than most countries, has a predilection for feeling itself uniquely innocent. As Ronald Reagan remarked in his State of the Union address in 1984, how can we not believe in the goodness and greatness of Americans? How can we not do what is right and needed to preserve this last best hope of man on earth? We will carry on the traditions of a good and worthy people who have brought light where there was darkness. I live in a country apparently where there is darkness. In 2001, George W. Bush, of blessed memory, said, "I know how good we are," even as through his policies he tried his best to prove the opposite, declaring torture legally valid, while covertly flying those seized from the streets of foreign countries and imprisoning them without charge or trial in Cuba on land legally sovereign American territory and therefore subject to American laws, the laws thus abrogated. We've just been celebrating Magna Carta, which you have not evidently read. In 1984, under the auspices of Penn, Miller famously visited Turkey with Harold Pinter to investigate the persecution of writers. It was there he met a young man assigned to accompany him on the grounds that he spoke English. The young man's name was Orhan Pamuk. It was a meeting that would play its role in politicizing him. As he said subsequently, "Before long I had taken on a political persona far more powerful than I had ever intended," even as he was aware that, as he said, someone who has been the victim of tyranny and oppression can suddenly become one of the oppressors. Even the Jews have their Jews. Pamuk was later put on trial. His books were burned. He was the target of assassination attempts. His crime, to make a statement about the Armenian genocide. His statement read, 30,000 Kurds have been killed here and 1 million Armenians, and almost nobody dares to mention that. So I do. The trial subsequently collapsed. His commitment began with his meeting with Miller. Pamuk was subsequently awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. All goes back to that meeting. Politics is seldom straightforward, especially in America, which offers itself to the world as a template for democracy, while Illinois politicians are barely elected before they're processed into prison. In fact, the governors of 9 states have been found guilty of federal offences. America is currently the 19th least corrupt country out of 177, not a boast you tend to hear much of in State of the Union addresses. The UK is 14th least corrupt. Hooray for us. If you're interested, Denmark and New Zealand are the least corrupt, but their economies are based on pigs and sheep, and in the case of Denmark, a perverse interest in herrings. The comedian George Carlin has remarked that honesty may be the best policy, but it's important to remember that apparently by elimination, dishonesty is the second best policy. A policy plainly adopted by another American president when he declared, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." When it comes to freedom of expression, it may surprise you to know that in the 2014 World Press Freedom Index, the UK comes 33rd out of 180 countries in the Press Freedom Index. The United States is 46th. Arthur Miller, who had lived through the suppression of free speech in the 1950s, gave us his version of Ibsen's An Enemy of the People as a reminder of that fact. When the Crucible was staged in New York, 6 months on from 9/11 and 5 from passage of the Patriot Act, Miller saw it as newly relevant, a play, he said, about paranoia and hysteria. Patriot Act authorized the indefinite detention of immigrants, searching of property, telephone, email, financial records without court order, seizing of library records. So it was possible to see what books Americans were reading. Dear God. You have to say the librarians refused to collaborate. Beyond that, though, the Crucible's portrait of a man who stands up against the orthodoxy of the day and suffers accordingly has never lost its relevance around the world. It is a play which dramatizes the ease with which we watch others persecuted and simply stand by as if it had no relevance to us until it reaches out finally to touch us. It stages the price that can be paid for resisting authority, for rejecting the narrative offered by those with the power to enforce it. It presents the uncomfortable truth that neighbour can turn against neighbour, as they did in Salem, as they did in the former Yugoslavia, Northern Ireland, Ukraine, Libya, Iraq, Syria. Miller's plays have never lost their relevance. When Arthur Miller died, an Arthur Miller Freedom to Write Memorial Lecture was established. The first was delivered by Orham Pamuk, who insisted that when another writer in another house is not free, no writer is free. For Israeli writer David Grossman, who also delivered an Arthur Miller lecture, literature is one of the few places where we can allow ourselves to explore tenderness or sympathy for the other. And that, of course, is one of the methods, functions, and perhaps justifications for literature. In literature, barriers of gender and race dissolve. Writers cross national boundaries, imaginatively and literally. For the Irish writer Colm Tóibín, writers don't have passports, though unfortunately there have been times when that was literally so, as government stripped writers of their passports, the very sign of citizenship, the fate, of course, of Arthur Miller. Carlos Fuentes was banned from the United States for a number of years. It was Arthur Miller who secured his entry in 1966. The Colombian Nobel Prize winner Gabriel García Márquez, who recently died, was banned from the United States for decades, a ban finally reversed by President Clinton, who had been caught reading 100 Years of Solitude in a class at law school. Márquez responded by defending Clinton in the Monica Lewinsky affair, tit for tat, if you excuse the expression. Writing to Batuz, the artist, philosopher and activist in 1990, Miller insisted that at this stage of his life he could serve better by concentrating on his plays rather than trying to move the world through letters and speeches. It was an admission that, though for most people he was the author of a series of major plays right the way through his life, not just those in the 50s, right the way through his life, and plays which had their political implications. For much of his life, he'd been active in the political realm, signing protests, making political speeches, joining organizations, sponsoring events, fighting to release those imprisoned for challenging power around the world. Many of the issues he engaged with over the years, though, have now passed into history. Vietnam is behind us. House Un-American Activities Committee concluded in 1975. The plays, though, continue because, as he said, I don't write plays, I write metaphors, which is why they're constantly being reinterpreted. Miller's theatre was not polemical, except at the very beginning, when as a Marxist he wrote plays for the trade union movement. But he did write plays that staged the private consequences of public actions and the public consequences of private actions. Everything, he once remarked, ultimately is political. Everything finally ends up being part of the way we govern ourselves. I don't write political plays in the sense I'm writing some kind of argument. They're about people, seen, I hope, in a totality of which society is a part. If any American playwright, if any American writer addressed the tensions of his time and our time, and in a sense exemplified them, it was Arthur Miller. If any American playwright insisted in his work on the struggle to sustain a sense of personal integrity in a context in which compromise was offered as a rational and desirable alternative, it was Arthur Miller. If any writer saw the freedom of the writer, and through that the human rights of all as central to his work, it was Arthur Miller, a man who recognized the ambivalence of performance, but found in performance an avenue to truth. When he died, a local woman, a neighbor, remarked, just because he had progressive ideas and dared to challenge authority, they called him a communist. What he was deeply devoted to moral responsibility and social justice. It's now 100 years since his birth and 10 years since his death. The words on his grave tell you all you need to know of him. They read, Arthur Miller, writer. He didn't join in that big public debate which the Jewish intellectuals in New York waged, and it was a very bitter one. He wrote, but he wrote privately. You'll find them in Texas in the Harry Ransom Center. But he didn't join in that public debate. Whether he actually knew her personally, I don't think he did. He did get extremely interested in the Holocaust as a result of marrying Inga Morin. Some of you will know, well, especially if you've read the book, that before they got married in 1962, Inga took him to Mauthausen concentration camp because her parents had been members of the Nazi Party, not ideologically, but because they were professionals in the university and it was wise to do that, although Inga refused. But she felt she couldn't marry an American Jew without placing right in front of him what that history was. And he went straight back and wrote the concentration camp tower into After the Fall, immediately. Not a surprise that he did Fania Fenelon, adapted the Fania Fenelon book, or that he did Incident at Vichy. This is Arthur Miller completely changed by marrying Inga, as opposed to marrying Marilyn. He was married to Marilyn for 4 years and 4 months. He was married to Inga for 40 years.
Since Miller passed away 10 years ago, and as you've tracked productions since then, have you noticed a difference in reception? Because previously, Miller was so integrated into the works, and people would always, like with After the Fall, reflect on his own biography, and the two would get so confused. Do you feel that the productions recently have been able to live more independently and therefore have more power?
Well, being British, I do have to point out that a lot of the plays that failed in America succeeded in Britain. The American Clock ran for, which Joan knows all about, because it's partly the family, and Joan played her own mother in American Clock, but it had a very short run in New York. It was an amazing success at the National Theatre in London. I've pointed out to people in the past that the National Theatre in London has done more productions of Arthur Miller plays than by any playwright except Shakespeare. He complained that he didn't have a theatre in this country, but he did have a theatre in England. And so a lot of those plays that failed over here succeeded. Broken Glass was another classic that I mentioned. That won the Olivier Award in Britain. It was put up for a few in this country, but it didn't do any business. It wasn't a very good production. I sat in on rehearsals in both countries, and you could tell the difference. But that ran at the National Theatre. More recently, people have been doing experiments with Miller. The View from the Bridge that's coming is a radical experiment. I mean, I didn't know what to expect when I went in there. It was done at the Young Vic. No scenery, I think, no scenery at all, just a low wall around it. The only prop I saw was a small table which was actually used as a step to go through an exit, and one shoe. That's all I ever saw there. Begins with him taking a shower, Eddie Carbone taking a shower. So, literal water is coming down from above, and ends, if I can ruin it for all of you, well, you know already, it ends with the showers of blood coming down. The whole showers all the way across the stage, and it's like a rugby. I could say like a rugby scrum. Wouldn't mean anything to you. Like a football match over here, because they all get together. It's not just Eddie being knifed It is all of them, including the narrator, Alfieri, all together, all covered in blood, wrestling on the ground. Now, you see what I said before. How do you explain a performance? You can't. It was magical, but all I can say is it was magical. I can't convey performance. All you can do is go and see it. But the good thing is they nearly didn't get permission to do it. And it wasn't the Miller estate, it was the agent responsible for productions that obviously they connect up, because they didn't like Ivan Van Hoe's production of Streetcar, which they thought wrecked it. But they went along with it. I have to say, the estate has been amazingly open. As some of you will know, No Villain, that first play he wrote at Michigan, is on in London. I asked Arthur if I could print it, and he said no, because he thought it would distort his career. He didn't want a weak first play there, rather than, well, he didn't want a man who had all the luck, but he came round to a man who had all the luck, because it got a very good British production. It was saved by Britain. Bristol Old Vic and the Royal Shakespeare Company saved that play with 4 performances in this country. So I've lost the sentence in which I was launched so vigorously there. I can't remember how it began, but it must have been very interesting. The terrible moment in Arthur's life came towards the end when Rustin said something nice about him, because he got so used to being slagged off by Rustin. Rustin was an enthusiast for Beckett, an enthusiast, as he himself said, for plays in which the audience left at the interval. They had Arthur Miller tagged as the writer of realist plays, which is again why I like these non-realist productions that are going on at the moment, because it shows what a mistake is. How you can look at Death of a Salesman and think it's sort of realist, I have no idea. But a lot of the later ones were very self-consciously non-realist, because he was working against that. But he was tagged so early on as being a Marxist playwright. What kind of plays do Marxists write? Oh my God, they write social realist plays. And the thing I quoted today, that's today's magazine going on about it being a communist. What the hell has that got to do with anything? I mean, Tom Stoppard is conservative. So, what difference does that make, for heaven's sake? But also, we're not frightened by plays about social issues in Britain. We're not terrified by the word socialist in Britain. Here it is like child molesting, but in Britain it is part of the political system. And indeed, the criticism that's made over here was, oh, no wonder it goes in Britain, because they've got all those socialist directors. And the other wonderful reason given for his success abroad was he improves in translation. In England? So it's a combination of things, with certain critics with certain hang-ups. But all the major critics gunned for him, including the person who wrote the first biography, Gottfried, who wrote vicious reviews of Arthur Miller plays and then wrote a biography. Arthur used to refer to him as that shit, with egregious errors. For example, he put in it, I mentioned this to Enoch the other day, that Miller's daughter had a stillborn child. No, she didn't. And I said to him, no, she didn't. And he said, well, what do you expect? They wouldn't give me permission to talk to people. I think, what? That's your basis on which you're going to put something in a biography? They wouldn't tell you, so here it is. I'll make it up. So in Britain, also, we don't have the New York Times. The New York Times, when it was Broadway, well, even when it wasn't Broadway, has absolute power. I don't have to tell you that. We've got 5 dailies, 4 nationals. We've got the BBC television, BBC radio, all reviewing. It doesn't matter what one of them says. But if you get as you well know, if you get a mediocre review in the New York Times, you are in trouble. If you're putting a play on at the Guthrie and the New York Times goes up there and it doesn't come into town. Trouble with Arthur, I think, at the end was he still had Broadway in his mind, because he started on Broadway, and that's where he thought he'd have a dialogue with America. Broadway was where he headed. Sam Shepard never went near Broadway. I don't think he caught on until quite late about the strength of regional theatre. You have to say he's caught on now while regional theatre is in trouble, financial trouble at any rate. But that was his problem. That's why he said he didn't have a theatre. He thought with Lincoln Centre he'd have one, but Lincoln Centre never really worked. It certainly didn't when he was around. The very first ones were all failures. It just did not work as a national theatre. Much more difficult to have a national theatre in a country 3,000 miles across and 1,500 miles deep than it is in England. I mean, the whole of the United Kingdom would fit inside Kansas, God forbid, but it worked. And this makes a difference. And also I think theatre is important in this. It has a role in the culture and is acknowledged as such. Why else are you importing all these British actors, which are in everything nowadays? You can't turn around. Television drama, stage drama. Well, in the Crucible, which is about to open, is it? Another British actor in there. Sometimes you don't even recognise them as British because in the old days, British couldn't do an American accent, and for God's sake, Americans couldn't do British accent. That all changed 20 years ago, maybe longer. Now they're very convincing. But that's why you like our actors. That's why you like European directors, because it matters. In Germany, theatre matters. Not necessarily very good, but it matters. In fact, the worry for me about Germany is heavily subsidised. I'm a great believer in subsidising the arts, especially theatre. Germans have been subsidising their theatre for a long time. Why isn't it better? I think because they are obsessed with directors rather than writers. It's a director's theatre. Whereas in Britain, it's a writer's theatre. Well, the Royal Court was established to be a writer's theatre. Well, here the signature is a writer's theatre. But in Germany, you're not interested in it being Hamlet, you're interested in who the director is. But European theatre has been very powerful. I once asked Arthur for a printout of his plays in Germany, and those were the days, remember, computer printouts were folded sheets that came spooling off. He just gave me this pile. Just opened it. And all these regional theatres, all these civic theatres were putting on Arthur Miller plays at a time when he was being ridiculed here, especially for the last 30 years. That's a very long, rambling answer. I mean, fundamentally, I don't know, but I think all of those things have played a role in it. So, as you know, that play went through 4 different versions, and I don't know how they arrived at that one. I was surprised when the estate agreed for it to be put on. But in Britain, that and The Hook are being celebrated. The Hook is celebrated as an unknown work. Have these people read anything? Any of the academics at any rate. But The Hook, which is a screenplay for those who don't know it, a waterfront screenplay, has been turned into a play put on by Northampton. You see, not London, put on by Northampton. But actually, when the Crucible first came to Britain, it was put on at the Bristol Old Vic. It was 11 years before it came to London. That wasn't always like that. I think that Britain grew into it. But there was always an excitement about plays from America in those days. And the new Tennessee Williams, you would really look forward to it. Because there was sex in those plays. We had a strange censorship until 1968, the Lord Chamberlain. The Lord Chamberlain, you had to send a script to the Lord Chamberlain. And he would not just say no, he would write back and say, you may not say fuck, but you can say shit. So you'd actually have this crest of the Lord Chamberlain, this very elaborate thing, and all these vulgar things that typed out underneath it. And so America always seemed such an exciting place. The American movies were exciting, American theatre was exciting. When Arthur came over with Marilyn in 1956 to do the British production of View from the Bridge, Peter Brook, again, production, and she was making the Prince and the Showgirl, they decided to go to the theatre. And Marilyn chose a play they should go to on the basis of its title, and the title was Look Back in Anger. And that was the beginning of the English theatre trying to catch up with the rest of the world. But you have to say, Look Back in Anger. We were discovering naturalism 40 years after everyone else, but it did mean that the British theatre changed, and the following year it was Harold Pinter, whose own first play failed. So Arthur Miller's first play failed, Tennessee Williams, Battle of Angels failed, Arthur Miller's Man Who Had All Luck failed. look across at Chekhov. And they all went through this excruciating experience. It's a terribly vulnerable thing. I'm doing a literary festival at the moment, and the guest of just over a week ago was David Hare. And he talked about how excruciating it is to be a playwright and to sit there in the audience and hear them react or not react, and to hear the comments they make as they go out into the foyer, into the lobby. You are stripped naked, and your whole career depends on the actors and the directors. It's quite possible for a good play to have a bad first production and then nothing happens to it. Certainly doesn't get into print. A bad novel is in print, it's in libraries and so on. Bad production of a new play, you're in trouble. Well, Miller always thought he was the best director he'd had. Directed Salesman. Then they had the break because he named names and Miller didn't. Then Kazan came back in after The Fall, in which he's one of the characters. I mean, how bizarre can you get? But he came back in for that. Many decades later, there was an honorary Academy Award for Kazan, and at the ceremony, about a third of the audience sat on their hands because of the memory. I mean, I just accused America of ignoring history. Certain things it doesn't ignore, or certain things people don't ignore. That whole 50s episode resonates in a lot of people's minds. But Arthur wrote a piece in praise of Kazan and said, all right, everybody makes a mistake. The real villains weren't the people who named names. They were the people who forced them to name names. And he remained the best director he'd seen. But on that occasion, he stood up and supported Kazan. And that it didn't exactly heal the breach, but that's what he did. Okay, thank you.